second. All right. And welcome everyone to a wonderful Saturday workshop and lecture. We're presenting Making a Mark right now. We're going to have Mallory Genauer of the U of M Kelsey Museum of Archaeology give a little presentation about the history of the written word through cuneiform and pictographs. It'll be a really great presentation, and then we'll talk a little bit about the workshop that's coming up next week at Sugar Hill Clay. Again, if you're interested in participating, that's from 1 to 4 this next Saturday, the 28th. Go to detroit.aiga.org. Look for the event, and please join. It'll be a lot of fun. We're going to be making our own tablets that stand the test of time, and also talk a little bit about what it means to create graphic design, a bit about symbology, and everything there. So really excited to introduce Mallory to you. Mallory has more than 7 years experience in education. She's the community and youth educator at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. She has experience from training in classical art and archaeology from the University of Edinburgh, and also humanities at the University of Washington. Mallory spent the past 5 years working with Native American communities in Washington State and California to expand reservation museum education programs, and she's also served on the board of directors of the San Diego Museum Council as the education chair, bringing outreach programs and other professional development to the greater San Diego region on the behalf of more than 40 area museums. So we're really happy to have Mallory right in our backyard here in Ann Arbor. So take it away, Mallory. I'm really excited to see.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I'm excited to be here today, and we're going to dive right in because we have thousands of years of history to cover here in the next hour or so. So today we are going to talk about a few different writing systems. We're going to be taking a close look at some objects from ancient Mesopotamia, Iran, Egypt, and Rome that focus on the advent and use of writing in those places. So we're going to talk about how and why these systems of writing developed, and we're going to talk about how they were used and what they can tell us about the people who used them. So to start off, it is important to understand that what we're going to be looking at are not languages. They are writing systems. So what is writing? Writing is a visual representation of sound. So there are several different types of writing systems. So the English language, along with Spanish, French, Russian, for example, use an alphabet system where each symbol or letter represents a sound. There are systems in which symbols represent syllables, and these are called syllabaries. So examples of syllabaries are the Japanese writing systems of hiragana and katakana, Cherokee, some cuneiform symbols, the Mayan script, and the Linear B script, which is the language of Mycenaean Greece. And a third type of writing system is called a logography, which is a concept or idea-based system in which each symbol represents a word or idea or a morpheme, so a word element like ing, or some other semantic unit. And examples of logographic systems include kanji from Japan, Chinese characters, some hieroglyphs, and some cuneiform. So we are going to start today. We're going to begin in Mesopotamia and Iran. But let's set the stage for the development of writing. By about the 8th millennium BCE, in this area, we begin to see a shift from people living in nomadic groups living in a predominantly what has been in the past termed hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And we begin to see them make a shift into a more sedentary life way. We see the beginnings of permanent agricultural settlements. And this time period is known as the Neolithic or agricultural revolution. So by about the 5th millennium BCE, these settlements, these small, what were originally small agrarian settlements, have begun to grow into more substantial towns and cities. And between 4500 and 3800 BCE, we see major cities like Ur of Gilgamesh fame, Lagash, Tepe-Gian, and Nippur, which is in here. So as these smaller settlements grow into these very large cities and kind of city states, we begin to see society become more complex. We see social stratification beginning, political hierarchy, and economic structures. Because as you get more people settled into a central area, society gets more complex. There's more things to do. How do you relate to one another? How do you conduct business with one another? It's during this time that we see the shift from what was a gift economy to a barter or trade economy. And because of this shift in the economy, we begin to see things like agricultural surplus, job specialization. We see long distance trade. So we're seeing trade not just within the Mesopotamian region, but we're seeing trade with the neighboring people all the way down to Egypt. We're seeing division of labor, taxes, and things like public and private property. So all of these complexities, all of these things lead to the need for better record keeping and means of communication. So while written language, as we would define it, appeared approximately about 3200 to 3100 BCE in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, about the same time, writing systems like cuneiform and hieroglyphs, which we're going to look at later, were actually latecomers to the communication game. People had been communicating via written or drawn symbols for thousands of years by then. Paleolithic humans conveyed meaning through pictures called pictograms. And pictograms would continue to be used in and of themselves, as well as incorporated into early recording systems, like the one that is seen on this tablet, which is actually from the British Museum. They have more stuff than we do sometimes. And so we can actually see one of the very early communication systems, which is a combination of pictograms, and other kind of written symbols. So here we can actually see, here would be a pictograph. These are our pictographs, and they can see they look like sheaves of wheat. And then we have just dots that represent numbers. So this is actually the record of the barley tax, the barley. So here we have our barley pictograph, and then the amounts that was paid to a temple as a tax. One of the other places where we see pictographs being used as a means of communication is on seals. Now, seals like these were used by the elite class, which was a class that now existed with these more complex social structures, as a signature in order to authenticate a transaction or a contract. So these stamp seals come from the early city-state of Tepeguian, and the image is carved into the stone so that when the stone it was pressed into clay, which you can see, which we've done here, the image appears in relief. Now, clay is our medium of choice in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia. We don't see the use of paper or papyrus until later. But clay, and as you guys are going to discover next week, clay lasts a long time. It was a much more reliable source for record keeping. You know, once clay is fired, it retains its shape even when it's broken. It's why ceramics are one of the most often and most abundantly found artifacts on pretty much any excavation site. So these date to an early period, about that really early period, about 4500 to 3800 BCE. Later, these seals, these stamp seals, which were pressed into the clay, give way to kind of more complex designs on cylinder seals, which we can see here. And then these seams were carved into the cylinder. And when the cylinder was rolled across the clay, an entire scene would be revealed. Now, these stamp seals, these cylinder seals, often incorporated in later periods cuneiform writing on them. But what these were, this was a form of identity. All of these, the stamp seals or the cylinder seals, here we see the cylinder seals from the top down, were pierced through the center so that they could be strung on a string, a piece of leather, and worn as a bracelet, as a necklace, or tied to your clothing in some sort of way. Now, as I mentioned before, that only the elite would have had a cylinder seal, because only the elite would have had some reason to be signing a contract or authenticating a transaction. So if you saw someone walking around town with a cylinder seal or a stamp seal somewhere on their person, it conveyed status. It was a status symbol. So not only just this kind of tiny, what looks like a tiny bead, and you can see for size here, the size that we're looking at, some of them are very small. Here, just a couple of inches, an inch to maybe at most an inch and a half long, we're talking. But when we look, so it conveys the status of the person. But when we look at what these people are choosing to put on their seals, we're looking at their identity. How do they identify? How do they want to be known? This is their signature. This is their John Hancock. You know, everyone is going to know that this belongs to a specific person. So we can see the images on these early seals. We have a human figure with two animals. Here, some sort of maybe farm implement and a snake. We have again another snake on this one with a long bighorn sheep or an ibex with the sun symbol. This is a really interesting one. We have this sort of seed shape with the wheat sheaves, and some people think that these are legs and these are arms. I actually think that these look like breasts with the seed in the middle. So it looks like some sort of fertility symbol. But think about why someone would choose a specific symbol to have on their cylinder seal. What are these images conveying about the person? This is a really interesting choice. We have these sort of bull-headed figures. We can see the horns here, but they have kind of human faces, and they're fighting wild animals here. So we've got some sort of animal with a horn. We have a lion here, but we kind of have these half human, half bull creatures as well. So it's a very interesting message, whatever this person is trying to convey about themselves. So thinking about how these symbols, these early symbols, conveyed meaning, and how they were used, and how people thought of them, and how they were accepted within the culture, it gives way into the development eventually, kind of from those really early writing system that we saw on the tablet from the British Museum, where we have a combination of pictographs and symbols, to the more kind of what we would typical things of a writing system with cuneiform. Absolutely, yeah. So cuneiform, as I mentioned, developed about between 3100 and 3200 and 3100 BCE. Cuneiform shows up first in the city of Uruk, and all of the early documents that we have are kind of bookkeepers. It's a bookkeeper's tool. The earliest documents that we have are bills of sale, taxation, property records, but we soon see that the ease of this and convenience of a writing system like this, it spreads to many different forms. And we're going to look at a couple of different tablets to kind of show you the different types of messages that are being conveyed and types of content that's being conveyed using these writing systems. Now, cuneiform means literally wedge-shaped in Latin, and you can see why. It's made up of a lot of wedges. It's actually made up of 3 different types of wedges: vertical, horizontal, and diagonal wedges, which were created when you pressed a reed stylus into the wet clay. And cuneiform is a combination of syllabary and logography. So we've got symbols that make up syllables, and symbols that make up whole ideas or words. Now, this document that we are looking at is, why are we not moving forward? Is a sales agreement, and it's in the Babylonian language. The cuneiform writing system was used to write more than a dozen different languages. So again, it's a writing system, not a language. This one happens to be an Old Babylonian, and it's a sales agreement. And we can see here, this is all the same tablet, front, back, and these are the sides. And we can see these are the stamp seals of the people who are signing this document. Now, sometimes we don't get so lucky as we do with this document, because on this document, not only have they used their stamp seals, but whoever was writing this document included a transliteration or a translation who these people are. So we actually know the names. So right along here, these cuneiform symbols are the identifying these marks. So we're beginning to see, or we're continuing to see, a combination of written symbols and pictographic symbols to convey a message. As I mentioned, cuneiform starts out of economic need in Mesopotamia and Iran. That was its first use. It was a bookkeeping tool, but it spread very quickly to be used to write many different documents. So here we have, there were literary works of literature. The most famous is probably the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a lamentation poetry poem, this one here. And this began to be used for regular communication. This is a letter from King Hammurabi of Hammurabi's Code, and he is actually writing to a local governor who made a misstep and granted land to someone who he shouldn't have. The land already belonged to someone, and King Hammurabi is like, "Give it back, you dummy." That's basically what he's saying in this letter. He's like, "Who are you to grant land? I am the king." You know, that's the tone of the letter. We also see people represented in these documents who are oftentimes left out of history. We actually have in our collection a document which is a sales agreement between two women. One woman is selling a room in her house to another woman, and the witness is another woman, which is, unheard of. Women don't usually make the pages of history, but we have these documents that are not just conveying the kind of letter of the law, conveying land, conveying poetry, but we're getting a look into who these people were who were using this tool. Now, it may seem, because we have so many of these different tablets and their content is so diverse and they're dealing with people from many different classes. Obviously these women are not, super elite. They're selling one room in a house, in a 2-room house. But the truth is that the literacy rate, the estimated literacy rate in ancient Mesopotamia, Iran, and Egypt, we think it's about 1%. So it's really important to not just think about what is being written, but who is doing this writing, what's the intention behind it, and who is it for? If only 1% can read, who is writing for? And how are they using it? Why are they writing things down? If no one can read it, even the people who are involved in the contract can't read it. What is the purpose of this writing? Why write it down? Things to think about. This is a really interesting object. Writing was a skill that few people had, not just reading, but writing. You had to go to school for many years to become a scribe. And this is one of the tools that you would have used to learn cuneiform. This is a school tablet. You'll notice the lines drawn on it, like lined paper, like we have at school today. And what would happen is the teacher would inscribe the symbols, the words, onto one side of the tablet. And then the student would have to practice on the other side of the tablet. And this one, the words are beer, mash, arable land, and the verb to go. So I always like to think, like, what kind of sentence were they trying to practice? Or like thinking about what kinds of things, what words were really important to learn? Beer, mash, land, and to go. Does anyone have any questions? You can pop them in the chat at any time, and Dylan will send them. As we move along in history, this is much later than the early documents that we were looking at. This is dates to about, this one specifically dates to about 1100 to 1080 BCE. And this is called a kuduru. This stands about 18 inches tall, maybe 2 feet tall. And this one happens to be a plaster cast of one, but they were stone monuments, which were land grants. They were freestanding. They recorded land grants from the king in return for materials or services. And the originals would have been set up in a temple, while kind of cheaper stone replicas of them would have stood on the property themselves. So here we see, again, a combination of written symbols. This is, and it's in cuneiform, and this is the Babylonian language, and imagery. So here we have, this one happens to be from a king, then here's the king pictured on it. And right down here, it calls him the avenger of his people. His name is Marduk Nadin Achi. And so it says his name and calls him, quote unquote, avenger of his people. And then it lists here the land grant, the kind of specs of the property, and the list of materials or goods that were provided. And here on our list, we have a chariot, 6 donkeys with 2 saddles, an ox, and then specific measurements of grain, oil, and clothing, just to mention a few. And the document is overseen. We can see all of these images are along the top, so they're kind of looking down on it, and they are affirming the contract. These are symbols of the divine gods in this area. So we can see a little bit closer, see some of the different symbols that represented these gods. So here we can see these 2 represent Enlil and Anu, who represented the sky and kingship. The turtle, this one, represents a god of water and fertility. We see these star symbols and sun symbols, which represent the god Shamash, the sun god, and the goddess Ishtar is the star. We have more symbols on the back. So you can see there's actually 17 different gods represented here, affirming this land grant. Now on this one, we're very lucky on these kuduru, because again, just like that document that had the stamp seals and and identifying who those stamp seals belong to, the text identifies who each of these symbols belongs to. So we're able to connect the imagery with the written system. So one of the questions is, how are they replicated? Yes, they were replicated by hand. So these would have been carved by hand from stone to kind of affirm these land grants. You can see when papyrus came along, it was a little easier to transcribe. People kind of clung on to paper, easier to transport, easier to reproduce. And the thing about clay, many of the documents that we have, the cuneiform tablets, we just kind of left out having them, because originally many of them were not, some of them were meant to last forever, but some of them, like letters or things like that, were not meant to last forever. We got lucky because there were fires in storehouses. And so they were accidentally fired and lasted forever. How many types of cuneiform do we have? So there's one cuneiform specific, that the technique of the pressing for the wedges, but it's more than a dozen different languages. So we have Babylonian, Sumerian, Akkadian. Those are kind of the ones that we see most often, the Babylonian, the Sumerian, and the Akkadian language represented in cuneiform. But there are, more than a dozen different languages we're using the cuneiform writing system. So think of it as the Latin alphabet, the Roman alphabet. How many languages use the Latin alphabet to convey that sound? So again, we're talking about English, Spanish, French, German. Are all using the Latin alphabet to convey different languages. Making sure I'm going to be on time here. So far, most of the documents and things that we have looked at have been economic in nature, although we did see the lamentation poetry, we saw the personal letters, we see the land grants and the Kuduru. But going back to this 1% literacy rate, is who is all this writing for? Why spend the time to write all of this down if no one can read it? And on the other end is, if you can't read, if you are not one of these people who were literate in the ancient world, how are you receiving all of this writing? How is this coming to you? What does it look like? What does it mean to you that this thing is in front of you with writing all over it? Yes, who can read? Mostly the elite class can read. Scribes within royal courts, you have people who can read, and actually scribes were multilingual. We know this from sites like Amarna in Egypt, where we have letters that are written in Egypt to the Mesopotamian kings in cuneiform, where they're being written in Egypt by an Egyptian scribe in cuneiform, and vice versa. So that we're seeing this kind of very small class of people who can actually read all of this writing. So why do this? What does it mean? How are people receiving this visual representation of sound? And it's one of the reasons why we continue to see the pairing of kind of three-dimensional imagery, sculptures, the representations of the gods on the Kuduru, the stamp seals that are still images rather than literally a stamp of your name in cuneiform or something like that, where we still see this pairing of imagery and text, because you're conveying the image, the message using both. Now, here we are looking at part of a relief that is part of a much larger sculpture. Nothing is not working. There we go. There we can see the whole sculpture, which is located in Iran. This is called the Bisitun Monument. It's on the Bisitun Mountain. And this is actually 322 feet above the desert floor, which is actually a very popular trade route, caravan route, which connected Media and Elam and Persia. Now, here we see This is Darius the First. Also, sometimes he's known as Darius the Great. And we know this is Darius because he is bigger than everyone else. He has a much more spectacular beard and crown. It's much more detailed here. We can see he has this extra little portion of beard here. He's bigger than this person. He is literally stepping on his enemies. Here we can actually see the foot and hands of the person that he is standing on. Here we can see it from afar. And we see Darius here with his weapons bearers, and he's stepping on this guy, and all of these guys, you can see their hands are actually bound. They are connected by chains around their necks. These are captives, and they represent each of the nations that Darius conquered. So why am I showing you this? We haven't seen any cuneiform, haven't seen any writing. Well, right here, what this looks like where it's scribbled, all of this is cuneiform. It's an inscription that basically is Darius. This is a huge billboard to Darius and to the greatness of the Persian Empire. So this here we begin to see writing as propaganda. And you can imagine, and all that this text says, and much like the Rosetta Stone, this is essentially the Rosetta Stone for cuneiform. It's written in three different languages, all in cuneiform. It's written in Old Babylonian, Old Persian, and Elamite. And it's the same text for all three, written in all three languages. And essentially it says, I am Darius the Great. I am King of Kings. I am awesome. I did all of this. I beat your guys' butts into the ground. Like, this is what he is talking about in this. And he lists, the nations that he has conquered. And each of these images of these captives, each is an individual. If you look closely, they're all dressed differently. This guy has a wonderful hat on over here. They have different hairstyles, different beards. They represent a different nation. So you have to imagine what it would be like to be one of these members of one of these conquered nations, going along the caravan route as you would for a trading mission or things like that, and seeing this billboard to the greatness of Persia. And how would you feel? This is words. Words have power. We see this time and again through history. Today, still, words are power. So with the early cuneiform documents, we're seeing words have the power to grant land, to settle disputes, to convey stories, to convey messages. Words have power. Here we see words conveying messages of strength. So on the flip side, maybe you were from one of these nations, but maybe you were Persian and you saw it and you're like, yeah, Persia's great. So kind of thinking about how people are seeing this message, these messages that are being conveyed. Okay. We're going to shift quickly to look at one of the other early writing systems, which developed at the same time as cuneiform, which is Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, if you were to ask Middle Eastern archaeologists, they would say that cuneiform was developed first. And if you ask an Egyptologist, they would say that hieroglyphs were developed first. But most likely, both systems developed simultaneously and independently of each other. And we actually see, which makes sense, because we see that hieroglyphs developed out of a completely different need and necessity than cuneiform. We see it being used in a very different way in its early documents, in its early form, where cuneiform was developed out of an economic and administrative necessity. Hieroglyphs seem to have developed and be used pretty exclusively for religious and kind of funerary purposes. So the first evidence for hieroglyphs are on labels for tombs, Dynasty 0 tombs, so kind of the earliest dynasty at the site of Abydos. And, but it is possible that hieroglyphs may have been used before this. We just don't have the evidence, and we see it kind of arise fully developed. So obviously there had to be some sort of system beforehand. As you can see, hieroglyphs look very different than we were seeing as we looked at cuneiform. The hieroglyphic system is a combination of logograms. So again, symbols represent a word. Ideograms, symbols represent an idea, a concept, and phonetic symbols. So a symbol represents a sound. So the places where we're finding these hieroglyphs being used are on tombs and coffins of kings, as well as funerary temples and complexes, which were being built by the kings, where they would continue to serve the gods in the afterlife. So when we look closely at these symbols, what kind of symbols are we seeing? We see here, we've got some body parts. So we've got a hand, a leg. I know there's a heart. Here's the heart, which if you actually look at it, looks like an actual heart. You can actually see the two valves coming out of it, because the Egyptians were the only ones who practiced autopsy. So they actually knew what the inside of our bodies looked like. We see tools. So here we have a scythe, a bucket, and we see objects of everyday life. Here's some sort of stringed instrument, feathers, animals. This is a mouth symbol. This kind of looks like a courtyard. So we're seeing things that the Egyptians would have seen every single day. Things in nature, objects of everyday life. So something to think about is why did the Egyptians choose these symbols? Why are these things kind of the objects of daily life? What is it about these symbols why they have been chosen? And the thing that I always think is really interesting is you can actually see, so there's a couple of different birds on this panel. And you can actually tell the different species. So these little guys here are actually quail chicks. So they're baby quail. And we have a hawk. Where's my cursor? There it is. Hawks. We have another type of bird here. I think, and there are in the dynastic period, which goes from about 3100 to until the conquest of Alexander in 332 BCE, there's about 800 symbols that are being used. After Alexander, it kind of spikes up to about 5,000 symbols that are being used, which we see because there are different concepts and new gods and different ideas that are brought in by the Hellenistic kings of the Hellenistic and Ptolemaic dynasties. So you needed more symbols to convey more ideas and more words. But let's take a closer look at this. So this object that we're looking at right here is a fragment from a tomb. This is the fragment of a tomb of a gentleman named Kar. Here we can see Kar right down here, who was an administrator during the reign of Pepi I, who was a king in the 6th dynasty. And The false door was part of the tomb that's on the outside of the tomb, where Car's family and friends could come and bring offerings to the deceased Car. It's also where Car's Ba, his kind of life force, could enter and exit the tomb. He could go visit the world of the living, coming in and out through this false door. Now, whereas cuneiform, we see it, it's written in lines, it's written right to left across. So like other Semitic languages today continue to be written right to left, Hebrew, Arabic. We see cuneiform written in that way, but hieroglyphs change directions, actually. We read them top to bottom in our columns, top to bottom, instead of across the lines. But what column do we read first? In that case, we always look for the living creatures, the people and the animals in the text. So here we look at the direction that all of these animals are facing. So here we see our bird, our horned viper here, Car himself, our little jackal. All of them are facing towards the right. Well, it's my right. It might be your side, different side on the other side of the screen. So how we would read this is we always read into the faces of the living creatures. So for this panel, we would read top to bottom, right to left. The animals are facing into this, so we're going to read into there. So we would read this column, and then we would read this column. And so let's just take a quick close look at this, just so we can learn to read some hieroglyphs on this magnified portion. Anytime that we see this circle around the any symbols, the circle with kind of this flat line, this is called a cartouche, which means a bullet in French, because the French first people who were Napoleon's expeditions thought that these looked like bullets, and so inside they're called a cartouche, and inside is the name of the king. So every time that you see a cartouche, it's the name of the king or of a god. So here we see repeating symbols, and this field or a bundle of sticks, if you look at it, if you get really up close, it looks like vertical lines with a single horizontal line going through it, and then these are feathers. So we know we're reading top to bottom, left to right. So we're going, and so these fields represents the sound p, and then the feathers are either the sound e or e. So we have pe or peppy. If we go up, we have this stringed instrument, this guitar, which is an ideogram. So here we have our phonetic sounds represented. Here we have an ideogram, and this represents the idea of, this is a logogram. So the symbol represents a word, and this is the word nefer, which means beloved or beloved. Now we get to the horned viper going up. This is an ideogram, and it represents the idea of a nickname, the concept of a nickname. And then when we come up here, these symbols up here, bird, mouth, bucket, are the phonetic symbols for Car. So we've got Car, whose nickname was beloved of Pepi. So his name, he was called Pepi Nefer, beloved of Pepi. So we can see represented here the different forms that hieroglyphs took. So we're seeing the objects like this, objects from tomb carved into tomb walls. And what these texts are that are included on these on these coffins and tombs, pyramids, these are spells. They are accounts of the deeds of the deceased person. But we see on later objects like this coffin, which dates to the 26th dynasty. So we're talking about 685 to 525 BCE. So much later than our Pepi Nefer, which was 2600. So that's 2000 years before. So we see that hieroglyphs have really developed and are being used within these coffins. So this coffin belonged to a gentleman named Jehudimos, who was a priest of Horus at the temple at Edfu. And this coffin was, with this coffin, he created his own little world. Now, when you think about all the objects that we have from ancient Egypt, they're coming, you think mummies, pyramids, tombs, all of these things that we found in the tomb of King Tut, everything has to do with death. So one might think that the Egyptians were obsessed with death, but quite the opposite is actually true. They were obsessed with living and with the idea of life after death and the afterlife. So that is what the purpose of all of these texts these were the instructions, the spells, everything that you would need to get through after you died. The Egyptians believed that you went on a journey through the underworld, a perilous journey where you had to you met with the gods, which we can actually see the gods here. You were mummified first. So here we see Jehudimos being mummified by Anubis. Here are his canopic jars with his organs, internal organs in them. You can see a kind of a nice up close of all of the hieroglyphs that are on his coffin. So after he would have been mummified, his body he would have gone on a journey through the underworld where he would have met and confronted all of the gods of the underworld. And he would have had to convince them that he deserved, essentially, to get to the afterlife, the happy afterlife, where he would continue living a mirrored life of his living life, which is why we find tombs with all of these goods in it. So it's why we have things like with King Tut. It's why he had boats and chariots and food and clothing, and we find makeup and a headrest for sleeping. And it's why mummification was so important, because you needed your body. If you were going to continue living in the mirror of the afterlife, you had to have your body for the afterlife and for the journey through the underworld. Now, in order to convince all of these gods and eventually the kind of big kahuna, Osiris, lord of the underworld, god of the underworld, that you deserved to get there, you had to make a negative confession. There were different steps, but you had to basically say, I didn't lie, I didn't cheat, I didn't do any of these really bad things. But what if you did? If you weren't such a good person? These spells, these hieroglyphs here, are essentially the cheat codes to getting to the underworld. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing hieroglyphs, this language, this writing system, not language, being used to ensure a better afterlife. We do see later in time, hieroglyphs and its kind of cursive version, hieratic, being used for administrative letters between kings, as I mentioned. During the Amarna period, we're seeing letters between Mesopotamian and Iranian courts and Egypt. But originally, this writing system was developed out of a religious a religious need. It was you needed these spells, so that when Jehudi most traveled through the underworld, he would have these spells, these cheat codes ready at the go. So we've seen that, I'm going to wrap up now. We've seen writing being used and writing being developed for two very different reasons. We see in Mesopotamia it being developed out of administrative and economic need. In Egypt, we see it arising out of a religious need. And we saw examples specifically in Mesopotamia of how how this cuneiform text was used in different ways to convey poetry, for personal letters, and as propaganda. But essentially, all of it, for all of this writing is powerful. Writing conveys power, it conveys particular, and again, we're talking about this 1% literacy rate in kind of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. By the Roman period, we get to about 15% literacy rate, so it does rise a little bit. And in Rome, the literacy rate is higher. But these early time periods, you really see the connection between the images that have been using, and there's kind of this really long transition from using the pictograms to pictograms and text to then just text only. And we see that even without, as we get these kind of this writing, that remember that the writing is used as a vehicle of power. Either you are conveying your own power, you're conveying your own wealth, and even in ancient Egypt, when we're talking about these coffins, not everyone had coffins like that. That is an elite person's coffin. That is an elite class. He was a priest of Horus. He had a very high status to be able to afford a coffin like that with all of those cheat codes, and those would become known as the Book of the Dead for the ancient Egyptians. So I hope you guys got a look at some of the kind of ancient writing systems that were developed, how they were developed, how people were using them, and have begun to start thinking about how people were receiving them. And, just kind of think about, if you were a literate person, if you weren't a literate person, if you were a local, if you were someone coming from outside, thinking about how people are receiving this written language, this kind of new vehicle for communication, and its connection with imagery. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Unfortunately, I have to jump off. I have another talk, but Dylan has my email, and you can feel free to email me any questions or comments.
Thank you, Mallory. I really appreciate it. That was a fantastic presentation. I think one of the things that I really gleaned from it was just how close so much of what our language system hasn't changed a lot, right? It's so similar in some ways, just it looks completely different. Great. Thanks again, Mallory of the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at U of M. Have a wonderful weekend. And we'll move on to Sitara now. Sitara, you're going to be talking a little bit about symbology and kind of about the workshop that we're going to be doing next weekend. Do you want to present a little bit?
My presentation I thought that is for next week.
Oh, okay, yeah. I just wanted to a brief preview of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for next week, we want to experience some making a message or create a message for our future people, or maybe for our present people, by playing with clay. I'm talking about what kind of ways that we can create the message, or what's the relationship between meaning and image, what is the sign and what is the signifier and sign, and if we create one symbol or one image, it can be represent so many things, as you see in this lecture, that they may be, for example, design an animal or something, but it represents something else. How we can use the different relationship between image and meaning to convey our message. And for example, we have pictogram, as she mentioned. We have symbols. We have different abstract images that each of them can have their own meaning. So I'm so curious that how we can have some connection with our future people, because we are living in a very contemporary life, and how the other people can read us in maybe 1,000 years later.
Yeah, I hope to definitely make a tablet or something like that that might wind up in an archaeology museum years from now. I love the one that Mallory was talking about, where it was one of the kings like yelling at a subject about like granting land, and I was just like, imagine if somebody's like your like awful call out text message was like conveyed 1,000 years into the future, and now somebody's reading you getting like yelled at by your boss pretty much. It was really fun. So we're gonna have a lot of fun with that. That is next Saturday at Sugar Hill Clay. It's from 1 to 4 p.m. If you're interested in attending, go to detroit.aiga.org. Sign up. We have limited spots available. We'd love to see you. There are discounts if you are an AIGA member as well, so be sure to go to the website and sign up as a member. And we'll be really excited to see you. If you have any questions, concerns, if you if you're a student, you might want to talk about a discount, please email me. My email address is dbox@detroit.aiga.org. And I'll be happy to talk with you. Hopefully we'll see a bunch of you there. And have a wonderful rest of your weekend, everyone. Enjoy the sun.
Yes, enjoy your son, and we really looking forward to see you for next week to have fun and play with clay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, be sure to bring some things you might want to use as like mark making tools and stuff like that. I've got a couple. I'm gonna make some cuneiform styluses and see if I can play around with them too. So yeah, bring some creativity. We'll have fun with it. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks again to Mallory for presenting. It's always great to get a little bit of history and prehistory, like with your graphic design education. Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dana,
everyone.
for everything. So see you next week.
Yeah, see you then. Bye, everyone.
Bye.